This is the Assessing Student Learning final product for SPED 875 by me, Catherine Hewitt. We'll go ahead and start by looking at the sample of student work, as well as the students that were involved in this project. So first, looking at group selection, these were 4th and 6th grade students who were already identified and placed in groups using the Words Their Way spelling inventory. These students were identified as needing initial consonant, final consonant, and middle short vowel, or CVC words, as their phonics skills for these intervention groups. And also in these groups were students with IEPs on my current caseload, and so these reading groups served as their service minutes per their IEPs. Looking at strategy selection and what data I used to make my strategy selection. So first I used the Words Their Way spelling inventory results. So again, it showed that these students needed to work on CVC words. In addition to that, I administered my own CVC pretest to determine the exact holes and skills. A copy of the assessment is that picture to the left there. And so with that CVC pretest, students were scored on the accuracy of both their letter sounds as well as reading whole CVC words. So now we're going to look at the student-centered goal that I created using that data. And so here's the goal that I created. By March 31st, 90% of the students will be able to accurately blend sounds to read CVC words using the successive blending strategy with 90% accuracy 90% of the time. So now we're going to look at the instructional decisions I made before actually teaching the intervention strategy. So we're going to talk here about the strategy I selected and why I chose that strategy. So first, I selected the successive blending strategy. If you're not familiar with the successive blending strategy, we're going to look at the picture and I'll explain what the strategy is. And so first thing that students were to do is tap out the beginning, middle, and ending sounds of the word. The next step is they would blend the first two sounds together, the beginning and middle sound together, and then they would tap out the ending sound, and then finally they would blend all of the sounds together. So it would go like this: b, ra, b, rob. And I had them say the word one more time just to get extra practice in. There were also pictures that came with each word, and so it gave students a clue as to what that word might be in case that CVC word was unfamiliar to them. And so as I demonstrated with the picture here, students sound out individual letter sounds as well as the whole words, fitting the student needs based on those assessments. And so I determined that successive blending was the appropriate strategy to use here. I also asked primary teachers in my building for suggestions on what strategy I should use based on the data that I had. And so multiple teachers recommended the successive blending strategy. I have limited experience with phonics, especially at this level, so I wanted to draw on the expertise that I had in my building. Now we're going to look at the measure of intervention, and so basically how I measured student success through this process. So the formal assessment tool that I used was the same type of CVC assessment that I used for the pretest. So again, I've got a copy here to the left. And so it is important to note that different words were used each time so that students were not just memorizing the words. Some words were reused between assessments, but they were never in the same place twice, as well as students only saw this paper assessment 3 times, including the pretest. So there wasn't ever really an opportunity for them to just memorize words if they didn't already know them. And again, students were scored on their reading accuracy of both letter sounds as well as whole words. I also used some informal assessments during this project. So formative assessments were used during the lesson. I followed the scaffolding I do, we do, you do model. And so in that we do and you do portion of the lesson, I offered specific feedback based on what I was hearing students say during the lesson as we were practicing. And so if I heard a student either substituting a letter sound or blending the word incorrectly, offering specific feedback and an opportunity to correct before moving on. And then students were also able to practice independently. And so to the left here, I've got a picture of a slide from an independent activity on our learning management system. I just took a screenshot of the successive blending that we were working on and posted it to a slide so that they could practice themselves. And so what students did is they used their iPads to record themselves reading these words using successive blending. And then what I did is that evening I listened to students' recordings, and then we went over it the next day where I could, again, offer feedback and practice. So now we're going to look at student work samples after the intervention to determine the effectiveness of the strategy. So here are the results from the entire process. So red is the pre-assessment, yellow is the halfway checkpoint, and then green is the final assessment, the post-test, if you will. And so I graphed student accuracy on their sounds as well as their whole words. And so looking at this data, all students at some point showed some level of improvement. Overall, the strategy worked, whether some students made the majority of their gains in the letter sounds or the majority of their gains in letter words or both. Either way, at some point, there was always improvement from that initial pre-test assessment. So that is really encouraging to see. However, not all of the students met the goal. So these statistics, it should be noted, these statistics were taken based off of the final assessment, so that green bar that we just saw. So only 55% of students scored 90% or higher accuracy on letter sounds, and only 11% of students scored 90% or higher on whole CVC word accuracy. Again, it's important to note that that's drawn from just the last score that students received, not the average of all three. So now I'm going to discuss some teaching adjustments that I would make for future teaching. So generally speaking, all students, or the majority of students, scored lower on that third and final assessment. So I'm curious, would using the pretest version or even a brand new version of the test would that have resulted in higher scores? And so it also calls into question the accuracy in terms of is that accurately measuring where students are at, or was the assessment just for some reason or another more difficult for students? So I'm curious, if I were to do it again with a different assessment, would the scores stay the same, or would they be better based on the growth that I was seeing previously? And so though not all of the students met the goal, they have moved on to digraphs. And so it's, again, important to remember that these are 4th and 6th grade students who are operating at least 3-4 years below grade level. And so what they really need is just some exposure to grade level content. And so that's why I've decided to move on and work on digraphs. That increased exposure to those higher skills means increased access to grade level text. And so we want them to be in a position where they have the strategies and skills necessary to access as much content as possible. And so I, at the end of this, had a discussion with students where I showed them the graphs. I asked them what they noticed about their own progress, what they noticed about the graphs as a whole. And so they have unanimously decided that they want to keep using this assessment process as they work through digraphs. So I have some takeaways. There are some things I realized, as well as finally some things that I underestimated and I didn't realize the impact of them going into this project. So we will start with what I realized. These are all things that I knew already, but what was realized was the impact that they had on not only my teaching, but student learning. And so I'll start with setting a goal before teaching sets the tone for instruction and the pace for instruction. It's funny, as a special ed teacher, I write goals for students, but yet I had never written a goal in terms of what I want students to work on in a specific intervention group based on a specific skill or strategy that I was going to be working on. But I really realized the impact that that goal had on my teaching. It gave me a very clear focus of what I was going to be doing and what I wanted to accomplish in these groups. And so I also realized the impact of ongoing assessment. Again, it's something that I knew, but in terms of the importance of using formative as well as those formal kind of summative assessments, using them together was really powerful in terms of how it informed my teaching and drove what I was working on with students, how I was teaching them, what tools I was using. And so it helps me make faster and more effective decisions instead of just constantly waiting for formal results. And so that formative assessment specifically was the most impactful in terms of that immediate feedback during whole group lesson time, as well as having students practice independently and then give them feedback the very next day on how they practiced. And so finally, the last thing that was very impactful to me was the power of clear daily objectives for students. And so what I did every day is I wrote the lesson objective in the form of an I can statement. I had us recite it. And so not only myself, but students also were aware of what we were going to be doing that day. They had a clear picture of what was expected of them, of where we were going in terms of the lesson, and what I wanted them to accomplish and what they wanted themselves to accomplish. And again, writing it as an I can statement set students up to take accountability and responsibility for their own education. And then finally, there were some things that I'll admit I did underestimate in terms of the impact that they would have. And so, first is the power of repetition, um, specifically using the same strategy every day, increase student confidence, and help them improve their performance. I noticed that by the end, students were almost getting bored and they were saying that it was too easy because we've been practicing the same strategy so long. But again, these are students who really struggled with reading at the beginning. If you had asked them if they, liked reading, they would have said no. They hated reading. They were the students who said, I can't read. And then now they're telling me that things are boring and it's too easy. Really shows, how much doing the same thing over and over again really improved their confidence. These are students who were excited to read, who constantly wanted to answer questions and volunteer. And so I really underestimated the power that repetition, specifically doing the exact same thing over and over again, I underestimated how much it would help these students. And then another thing that I didn't necessarily realize or think of before was sharing the goals and objective with students. Not only does that give them an idea of where they're going, but it gives them something to celebrate as they watch their own progress improve. Students by the end were able to memorize these objectives and they were able to say, oh, I know how to do that already. I can do that. And then showing them the graphs, they were able to really realize, like, wow, it did help. I did improve. I can read because that's what these graphs are telling me. And so it was really empowering to see the impact that sharing the goals and objectives had, not only just on me as a teacher, but on them as students. And that is it for my Assessing Student Learning project. Thank you.